So the topic is about termination of the war. And Sam and I realized when we took this on that it wasn't going to be over by the time we met in Ottawa, so we would not be talking about something that has occurred, and talking about something that might eventually occur is, of course, a rather risky proposition. So at the beginning of the paper, we quote Yogi Berra, among others, as saying it's hard to make predictions, especially if you're talking about the future. Our initial impulse was actually not to talk about probabilities, let alone inevitabilities, but about the possibilities. And that's where we started. That was our initial objective, and only rather late in the day did we come around to the idea that we should try and take this a step further and present this group with very, very rough and approximate estimates of what the probabilities of these outcomes are. So this was something we kind of discovered as we worked through this very short paper. And it's all, this should be written in pencil and not in ink, let alone in print, because we're learning from experience. But it certainly was a very interesting topic to address. And we knew it was going to be hard, but it turns out to be like really very difficult to do this right. We finished the paper on Monday, as Dominique will remember. So the writing of it is very fresh in my mind. And we quickly gravitated to the idea, I think it was Sam's from the outset, to simplify things. Now, you can slice and dice your thoughts about the outcome of almost any human process into many, many possibilities. Large groups, subgroups, divisions within the subgroups. You can try and anticipate contingencies, or we were going to call them wildcards at one point, which we really have not done. So you can make this very complicated, but we decided to go to the opposite extreme and to make it rather simple, and I hope you don't think it's simplistic. And so we said, can we not come up with a handful of possibilities? Big possibilities that can clearly be distinguished from one another. Consider what such a possibility would look like in the abstract, drawing, of course, on the literature, which is fairly substantial here, and then relate those to the Russia-Ukraine war. What would it look like in this case for these respective scenarios? We started with a different term. It was trajectories, right, or some pathways or something like that. But we ended up with scenarios which is a little bit more concrete. The literature, I'll just mention, you always go to see what's been written, and both of us knew something about this, Sam a lot more than me. You quickly discovered that political scientists, students of international relations, have devoted a lot more effort into explaining why wars occur, why they are initiated, than in understanding how they are terminated. And there are many reasons for that, but it's a fact. So there was some good stuff to read. It's actually, a lot of it, pretty closely connected with the literature on war initiation. And some of the authors are the same ones. And there are a lot of overlaps here. So on the basis of our reading of that material and of thinking about what's happening in the field right now, in theater, we distilled the possible outcomes to four, so a handful minus one. And the four are, in no particular order, total victory, somebody wins, absolutely wins, a negotiated settlement between the two belligerents, and I think intuitively you know what that means, and then the other two, protracted conflict and armistice. So just to anticipate the story, Sam will get around to the one that regretfully we now think is probably the most likely for the foreseeable future, which is protracted conflict. But let me say a word quickly about total victory and negotiated settlement, and then Sam will take over and he'll draw things together with a very nice bow at the end. Well, total victory, you kind of get the point just from the title, right? It means not just doing quite well on the battlefield, but actually winning big. And what an IR scholar would mean by that is stuff like occupying the capital city of the adversary, often even flying your flag over the presidential building, occupying other stretches of its territory, even all of it, simply swallowing the other country, installing a puppet government, which is something the Russians seem to have in mind in February, or to quote from one of these studies, at worst, annihilating the adversary's entire population. So the total victory then it goes beyond just winning a lot of battles and getting the other side to say, I give up. It's really about ensuring that your adversary cannot violate the agreement reached with you to cease fire, so that you deny your adversary the possibility to do harm to you in future. And that would apply whether you're the aggressor in the war, as Russia obviously is in this case, or the country that's on the defensive. You both have an interest in not just winning this struggle, but doing everything you possibly can to prevent it from happening again. And when I discuss this with Ukrainians, it's often a point that they come up with very quickly. It won't be enough to defeat the Russians in the short term. For safety's sake, we need to have these guarantees. Now, there is a cost constraint here. Victory, yes, but at what cost? So there's probably such a thing as total victory that comes at a cost that's so high that it's not really victory at all. It's some kind of Pyrrhic victory, to use the famous phrase. So what would it look like in the case of this war? Well, Zelensky now says he's changed his tune, but his current interpretation of this is we expel the occupier, just quote him, from all of our land, including the Crimean Peninsula. And Ukrainians' recent successes on the battlefield certainly suggest that this is possible in theory. We don't think it's terribly likely, but it cannot be ruled out. Our view is that under its current leadership, and that becomes a variable perhaps rather than a constant, but as things currently stand, those in charge in Russia, even if forced to retreat, even if forced, even if forced to retreat under circumstances that would be extremely difficult for them, we don't believe it's at all likely that they would give up. That is, I think they would retreat, regroup, and at least hold out the hope of doing it again, only better, which is something that Ukraine, of course, would have to take very seriously. And, this is, clearly the Russians had total victory in mind in February when they launched their assault on Kiev with the thought, it seems, of imposing some kind of pro-Moscow government. For them to achieve total victory, they have to have territorial gains and consolidate them. But they would also need two other things which would solidify their position. One of them would be really, I don't think there's anything much short of this that would work, to ensure a fundamental change in Ukraine's political system, which would install or bring to power a government that's amenable to Russian demands, which is certainly not the case right now. And the second condition would be to do something with, ideally, to deny Ukraine Western assistance or to somehow bring about a collapse of the current degree of Western support. And these both seem like very unlikely conditions. And so looking at both countries, we conclude that the chance of total victory on either side is quite slight. Now, negotiated settlement would be perhaps, some people might find it morally acceptable short of total victory. That's, of course, a debatable proposition. There will always be different points of view. And one thing that was kind of news to me, not so much to Sam, was that peace settlements that involve a treaty have become quite a bit less common since 1945 for a number of reasons. And yet, of course, they are signed and they can make a big difference. And these settlements occur after a process of negotiations. Now, there are no negotiations underway for the moment. It's interesting that public opinion polls in Russia, and we're seeing a whole lot of this data tumble out in recent weeks, indicate that a lot of ordinary Russians actually prefer what is referred to in the survey question as negotiations. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean any particular kind of settlement. This sort of opinion is very sensitive to question wording. So this question is asked in different forms in different surveys. But in one done by the Levada Center in August, before things changed on the mobilization front in September, we found that 45% of respondents favored negotiations and 48% favored a continuation of military operations. So there is a certain amount, maybe even a lot of support for negotiations, never mind what the settlement would be, in Russia. And it's very clear from a number of surveys now that there's a sharp generational divide here, that younger Russians are much more amenable to negotiations than the older generation. In Ukraine, it's actually quite difficult, from the polls that I have access to at least, to find out what people think, because typically the Ukrainian citizens are not asked, do you favor negotiations, but rather, under what conditions could you accept peace with Russia? So the negotiation variable is kind of left out, probably rather deliberately. Now, we have a couple of paragraphs here, that's all we could afford, on very interesting, to us at least, episode early in the war, when there were actually negotiations between these two countries. And in a press conference that Putin gave today in Kazakhstan, he referred to this brief interlude in which there were formal negotiations between delegations of the two countries in the first roughly 6 weeks of the war. Many people have probably forgotten that on March 29th, the negotiating sides in Istanbul, Turkey, said that they had reached agreement on the outline, at least, of a framework settlement. They didn't supply details, but the details were leaked. And Sam actually had his hands on one of those leaked copies and shared it with me when I was writing this section. And now, what these talks didn't address was anything territorial. Maybe they talked about it, but it certainly wasn't reflected in the 10-item agreement that the negotiators seem to have reached. The draft of this agreement was written by the Ukrainians, and the Russians then replied with a draft of their own, which, to the best of our knowledge, rather closely echoed the Ukrainians' points. And so no discussion of occupied territories, even the territories that had come under Russian control, direct or indirect, previously, that is Crimea and the parts of the two Donbass oblasts, were deliberately or specifically exempted from the 10-item agreement. But, okay, all right, so in one more minute I'll summarize what the agreement said, but it was largely about grand geopolitical issues, a commitment by Ukraine to be neutral, permanently neutral, not to join NATO, that kind of thing. So it seemed, we thought that was interesting because it seemed as if the two sides were capable of coming to some agreement on points like this, and then there would have to be a response, of course, by the Russians, which you can get into if you want, but agreeing to disagree on other issues. Anyway, this agreement fell through. Both sides moved away from it. On the Ukrainian side, probably it had something to do with war crimes. On the Russian side, it's not clear. So hypothetically, negotiations could resume. We think this is unlikely anytime soon for a number of reasons that are pretty well anchored in the literature. So the literature stresses 2 or 3 things. One of them is information. So for negotiations to proceed towards a settlement, one, at least of the warring parties, has to moderate its demands. And usually, historically, this occurs as a result of the information that it gathers during combat. In other words, the results of the fighting on the ground convince one of the belligerents not to press the matter. It would be better to work towards some kind of negotiated settlement. And for the time being, this does not seem to be happening, and there are a number of sort of wild cards there. What is the effect going to be of the Russian mobilization? It's really much too soon to tell. And what about Western assistance? Because Ukraine is not fighting this war on its own. It's very heavily reliant on what it gets from elsewhere. So there are a lot of question marks here. And the other condition, just to close on this point, is something about, to use an overworked phrase from the IR scholarship, credible commitments. So in order to negotiate and move towards a settlement, you have to believe that the other side would implement whatever is agreed. And not renege. And this is the stumbling block for a lot of negotiations like this. Is why they don't succeed. And at this point, that degree of trust or confidence in the other side would seem to us to be all but completely and utterly lacking. And there are things that can be done about that in the middle or long term, but it seems unlikely that this hurdle is going to be cleared anytime soon. So thank you, and sorry about the time, Dominique.